Hey guys, tonight we're heading to a place where the desert heat doesn't just come from the sun, and the river Nile isn't the only thing that flows. You're barefoot on warm stone, the scent of lotus flowers clings to the night air, and you can hear the distant hum of a reed flute weaving through the palms. It's Egypt 3,000 years before memes and microchips and sex is about as scandalous as brushing your teeth. Meaning, not at all. We're diving into a world where sensuality is out in the open, cheeky metaphors live in love poems, and papyrus scrolls blush harder than a first date. Ancient Egyptians didn't whisper about sex behind closed doors, they celebrated it in art, song, and story. So yes, while your modern brain might be picturing dusty tombs and stiff statues, the reality? It's steamier than you think. And honestly, you probably won't survive this without raising your eyebrows at least 3 times. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, comment below with your location and what time you're listening. I love seeing who's tuning in from where. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the sands with the cool night air brushing your skin, and it strikes you this isn't a land of repression. Sex isn't some dirty secret. It's as natural as the rising sun and as necessary as the Nile's flood. From a young age, you're raised with a clear, mostly unembarrassed understanding of bodies and desires. There's no blushing over anatomy schools teach medicine and fertility alongside math and astronomy. In homes of every status, from fishermen's huts to nobles' villas, children hear stories of the gods' amorous escapades without anyone clutching their figurative pearls. The heat of Egypt shaped more than just its crops. Loose linen clothes cling and slip, water is scarce, and bathhouses are communal. People live in close proximity. Privacy? Not really a thing. You see people bathe, flirt, argue, make up. You hear couples at night. It's all just life. There's a practicality to it too. Sex meant pleasure, but also fertility central to Egyptian survival. Children were a blessing, but if they didn't come, it wasn't taboo to seek help through spells, priests, or even aphrodisiac rituals. Wanting was never vilified, it was human. And if you were wondering, yes, Egyptians had a sense of humor about it all. Sex jokes weren't rare. In fact, laborers building pyramids would etch lewd little doodles and innuendos into rock walls. You see a wink in the hieroglyphs, a goose, a loaf of bread, and well, let's just say the ancient pickup lines were creative. You walk past a bustling riverside village. A newlywed couple is throwing a modest feast. Music spills out of the courtyard drums, lyres, tambourines. You catch a glimpse of her hennaed hands and his gold armband. They're laughing, pressed close. No stiff, formal distance here. Marriage is often based on affection. There are no elaborate contracts, no priestly ceremonies, just a mutual agreement, sometimes with a witness or a written note. Romantic? Surprisingly so. Still, sex wasn't just for marriage. Even common folks might enjoy casual relationships. It wasn't frowned upon unless it involved betrayal or crossed lines like, say, seducing someone else's spouse. Spoiler, there's a spell for that, and it's not a nice one. Historians still argue whether Egyptian society had a sexual double standard like modern ones. Some scrolls suggest women had a fair amount of freedom in romantic matters. Others point to legal texts warning wives not to go out and debase themselves. The answer probably shifts with time, class, and regionzo. Don't go assuming the whole desert was one big orgy. And then there's beauty always intertwined with desire. In marketplaces, people trade in perfumes, scented oils, and makeup. Men and women alike wear kohl eyeliner not just for fashion, but also for its supposed magical and medicinal benefits. Smelling good isn't optional, it's divine. Imagine date oil mixed with cinnamon and a touch of myrrh dabbed behind the ears. You're not just trying to look good, you're invoking the gods. In fact, cleanliness and grooming were practically sacred. You've probably heard the old Egyptians shaved everything, lineated. Yep, they often did. Wigs were all the rage. Some were purely decorative, but others hid baldness or helped with heat. Some even claimed certain styles signaled availability. You spot a man adjusting his elaborate curled wig near a perfumery subtle, but the ladies take notice. And the architecture? Sensuality hid in plain sight. You wander into a home, its walls painted with vines and fruit, ceiling stars twinkling in blue. The bed is low and wide, carved with figures embracing under a canopy. It isn't lurid, it's lush, life-affirming. You realize you've entered a culture that believes pleasure, like food or song, is simply part of being alive. There's even erotic furniture. Yep, we're talking beds with headboards carved into suggestive shapes, or cosmetic spoons where a naked woman rides a duck. Don't ask how the spoon works. Just appreciate the creativity. Still, not everything was carefree. Adultery, especially against a husband, could land a woman in serious trouble. Some ancient texts describe public beatings or exile for infidelity. But historians still argue how often those punishments were applied, and whether they were more about maintaining order than morality. And you feel oddly comfortable in this world, not because it's perfect, but because it's honest, where the human body wasn't shameful, where love, lust, and laughter mingled under the same stars. Sure, things weren't always equal or kind, but the openness, the lack of pretense, kind of refreshing. You lie back on a flat rooftop now, warm sandstone under your spine. Around you, a city settles into sleep. Somewhere, a lyre plays a slow tune. A soft breeze passes through linen curtains. Maybe this is why they built their tombs to last forever, not just to preserve the body, but to honor a life fully, sensually lived. You wake with the sun rising over the Nile, but tonight's journey picks up not in the streets of Thebes or the bedchambers of merchants, but in the clouds above where gods lounge, flirt, and occasionally self-fertilize. Strap in, because the ancient Egyptian pantheon was a soap opera with fewer inhibitions and significantly more ibis heads. The gods were not shy. In fact, they were often your first introduction to sexuality, mythologically speaking. As a child, you might have heard how Adam, the first god, created the world not by speaking or snapping his fingers, but by, well, pleasuring himself. Yup, cosmic self-love. He ejaculated the air god Shu and moisture goddess Tefnut into being. No need for metaphor. This was creation, pure and unapologetic. That awkward chuckle you're trying to suppress? Totally normal. Even scribes probably giggled while etching those stories onto temple walls. And a tomb wasn't alone in setting the tone. Isis and Osiris, arguably the most famous divine couple, were romantic icons. Their love story included devotion beyond death, literal dismemberment, magical resurrection, and yes, a post-mortem conception. Isis reassembled Osiris's body after he was murdered and scattered in pieces across Egypt. She couldn't find one key piece. You can guess. So she made one from gold, used her magic, and conceived Horus. Some historians still argue whether this myth symbolized fertility rites, royal power, or spiritual transcendence, but let's be honest, it's also wildly impressive commitment. As you stroll through a temple courtyard, the carvings come alive with these tales. Thoth, the scribe god, appears mid-scroll. Hathor, goddess of love and music, lounges with a knowing smile, often nude or playfully dressed. You realize these divine stories weren't just for priests, they were common knowledge. Everyone grew up hearing them, and they weren't all majestic or noble. Some gods acted downright scandalous. Take Set and Horus locked in an epic rivalry. They once fought not with swords but bodily fluids. One version of the myth has Set trying to dominate Horus sexually. Horus, clever as ever, flips the trick, and their trial is settled by a lettuce salad soaked in some questionable essence. No, really. Lettuce. You're not mishearing. Lettuce. Ancient Egyptians thought it had aphrodisiac qualities and possibly made you, more virile. It's a fringe tidbit, sure, but a surprisingly recurring one. Even Hathor is shown with offerings of lettuce. Salads never look so suspicious. Now, you might wonder, were these stories believed literally, or were they symbolic? Scholars still debate it. Some argue the sexual content reflected agricultural cycles, divine fertility, and the sacredness of reproduction. Others think it was just storytelling with some spice. What's certain is this: the gods weren't meant to be distant. They were exaggerated humans, which meant their flaws and their desires were perfectly normal. You reach the foot of a shrine and pause. A priest passes by, offering incense. There's no embarrassment here. Stories of divine copulation are whispered in prayers, danced in rituals, even chanted in festivals. Sex wasn't reserved for hushed corners. It was part of cosmic balance. One temple wall shows Mut nursing a grown pharaoh. Another, a grinning Bes, the squat protector of households and childbirth, shaking his hips in wild, suggestive dances. You smirk. Even the divine babysitter had moves. You find yourself walking through the fragrant gardens of a temple complex. Palm trees rustle gently in the breeze, and somewhere nearby, a priestess is singing. Her voice is low and slow, like honey poured into warm water. This is no ordinary place of worship. Here, the sacred and the sensual intertwine, and you start to realize that in ancient Egypt, even spirituality had a bedroom door. You pause at the edge of a shrine. The pillars are carved with lotus blossoms and entwined figures. Not violent gods or stern judges Nothes, are images of love and softness. Some historians believe this temple once hosted ritual performances that blurred the line between ceremony and seduction. Welcome to the tantalizing theory of sacred sexuality. Now, let's get this straight. We're not talking about wild orgiastic rites in every temple. But some scholars, and yes, they still argue fiercely about this, suggest that certain religious ceremonies may have included sensual or symbolic sexual acts. Maybe between priestesses and deities, or perhaps between humans embodying those gods. You walk slowly, careful not to trip on uneven stone. Ahead of you, a raised platform gleams in candlelight. Could this have once been a ceremonial bed? Some claim that during fertility festivals, especially ones tied to Hathor or men ritual union, reenacted the godly lovemaking stories we heard earlier. There's no definitive proof, of course. Mainstream archaeologists are skeptical. No temple manual says, Step 3, sensual embrace. But there are hints, reliefs of entwined couples, inscriptions that mention the goddess receiving the god's breath in sacred chambers. A few texts refer cryptically to rites of joining. Are these metaphors, literal events, sacred dreams? You lean closer to a stone panel. It shows a couple lying together, their faces serene. Around them, papyrus plants bloom and fish leap, symbols of fertility. One fringe interpretation: this could depict a ritual meant to ensure the fertility of the land through symbolic union. Or it might just be a really nice date night carving. You decide to keep both options open. And then there's the pharaoh. As divine ruler, he wasn't just head of state, he was also a living god, channeling Horus on earth. It's rumored that some pharaohs took part in symbolic copulation ceremonies to maintain cosmic order. Picture it, a grand chamber, incense thick in the air, the royal wife or priestess standing in as the goddess. One legend even claims a pharaoh publicly sowed his seed into the Nile to ensure its flooding and the land's fertility. Whether this actually happened is highly debated. But hey, it's not the weirdest thing a ruler has done to impress the gods. You pass under a carved lintel where Hathor's cow horns cradle the sun. Her temples were centers of music, intoxication, love, and perhaps a bit of divine matchmaking. Priestesses of Hathor were known to dance and sing seductively during festivals. It wasn't just performance, it was invocation. Think of it like spiritual flirting. The goal wasn't scandal, it was harmony. By embodying joy, beauty, and yes, sensuality, worshippers believed they were helping the gods stay balanced and generous. Because in Egypt, the divine didn't respond to denial, they responded to delight. You find a hidden alcove behind the temple. There, a worn alabaster basin still smells faintly of scented oil. The tools of worship ritual unguents, polished bronze mirrors, and perfumed cones look suspiciously like items from a very fancy date night. And maybe that's the point. Sacred sexuality didn't mean raunchy chaos. It meant acknowledging desire as a divine gift. Pleasure was part of the ritual, not a deviation from it. And yet there's mystery. No papyrus says, here's the exact way we do sacred sex. No temple priest left a journal titled, My Sensual Service to Hathor. Much of what we know or think we know comes from layered readings of symbolism, poetry, and, well, wishful modern imagination. Historians still argue whether these so-called sacred acts were ever physical at all. Maybe the sensuality was more theatrical than literal. A dance, a song, a suggestive pose in a perfume-soaked hall. Or maybe, just maybe, the line between mortal flesh and divine energy blurred more than we want to admit. You imagine the scene, a priestess covered in golden powder, dancing slowly under moonlight. The god statue is cloaked in linen and jasmine. Music thrums low and slow. It's not erotic in the modern sense, it's reverent. A calling, a connection, a reminder that pleasure isn't shameful, it's sacred. And for the average Egyptian, maybe you never witnessed such ceremonies, but their whisper trickled down to you through festivals, songs, myths, and customs. You understood that sensuality wasn't just tolerated by the gods, It was one of their languages. You stretch your legs and walk out into the temple's garden. The breeze is cooler now. A pair of birds flits overhead, chasing each other like flirty messengers. The garden was once filled with mandrake and blue lotus plants rumored to arouse or enchant. You crush a fallen blossom under your sandal. Its scent rises, sweet and sleepy. You wonder if the priestesses ever felt awkward, if they ever giggled, if they ever got tired of all the mystery and symbolism and just wanted a nap. Probably. But that's the beauty of it. This was a human culture with divine dreams. They didn't see sex and prayer as enemies. They saw them as partners in the same dance. You glance back one last time at the temple. It's quiet now. But once, its halls echoed with songs, its oils shimmered on skin, and its rituals honored both heaven and earth in equal measure. And maybe, just maybe, that's worth remembering next time someone says the ancient world was prudish. You're back on the dusty path, but now you're in the heart of a bustling village somewhere along the Nile, where laundry flaps in the breeze, kids squabble over date cakes, and your sandals stick a little in the muddy bank. Here's where the real education about sex begins, not in temples or scrolls, but in everyday life. Because in ancient Egypt, people didn't just learn about love and intimacy from myths. They learned from their neighbors, their families, and believe it or not, their schools. Yes, schools. You slip into the shade of a brick house, listening to a boy grumble as he copies hieroglyphs onto a wooden board. Scribes were the nerds of the ancient world. But with a twist, they didn't just write about kings and taxes. They copied poems, proverbs, and sometimes some seriously saucy material. One popular instructional text, sometimes called the Satire of the Trades, warned young boys not to become builders or tanners or farmers because, quote, they stink and work too hard. Instead, become a scribe and enjoy the finer things education, status, and, implied heavily, more romantic options. And then there were the love poems. Sweet, flirtatious, and sometimes shockingly frank. These poems were copied down for fun, for practice, and possibly to impress crushes. Imagine being 13 and your homework is to transcribe a verse that starts with, "My heart flutters when I see you pass by, and I can't even hold my pen straight." Ancient Egypt, the birthplace of smooth lines, but it wasn't all metaphor and longing. Some fragments talk about stolen kisses behind papyrus thickets, girls washing by the river while peeking over their shoulders, and boys pretending to fish just to catch a glimpse. There is one fragment where a young woman flat out says, "Let's spend the night together and forget the morning." And this was homework. Historians still debate whether these texts were educational, performative, or actual diary entries cleverly disguised as poetry. You suspect a bit of all three. You find yourself walking through an open-air market, the sun heavy on your shoulders and the scent of honeyed bread and roasted duck curling through the air. Between the stalls' woven baskets full of dates, bright bolts of linen, little jars of scented unguentu, notice something odd. A man is selling tiny ivory amulets shaped like, well, you squint. Yep, that's definitely a phallus. Welcome to the magical world of ancient Egyptian sex charms and love spells where superstition and sensuality dance like a pair of doves on a temple roof. You pass the stall and try not to giggle, but your Gaidia friendly woman in a gold collar whispers, "That one protects against unwanted desire." She points to another. "That one helps create it." It's easy to forget that for all their practical engineering genius and state-building prowess, the Egyptians were deeply magical thinkers. They believed the world was full of unseen forces, gods, spirits, curses, energy, sand. If you knew the right words, gestures, or objects, you could influence all of it, including matters of the heart, especially matters of the heart. You duck into a shadowy workshop where an old scribe carefully paints symbols onto a strip of papyrus. He murmurs under his breath, dipping his reed pen into a pot of red ochre. He's not writing a love poem, he's crafting a spell. Maybe to attract someone, maybe to bind them, maybe to cool desire or ignite it. Hard to say with this one, the script is intentionally vague. Ancient love spells often were. Some texts are surprisingly direct though. One well-preserved spell calls upon a lion-headed goddess to drive passion into the heart of target name, so that they burn for me as fire on the horizon. Dramatic? Absolutely. But also kind of romantic in a very obsessive candle wax sort of way. Historians still argue whether such spells were serious, symbolic, or just the ancient equivalent of a breakup playlist. The truth likely lies somewhere in the middle. People turned to magic when emotions ran high, when they felt powerless or heartbroken, or just wildly infatuated. Sound familiar? You examine a small stone figurine. It is of Bes, the dwarf god of protection, music, and bedroom activities. Bes appears on beds, mirrors, headrests, 7 birth amulets. He's cheerful and goofy looking, but don't be fooled. His main job was to keep evil spirits away during childbirth and protect your home from bad vibes. But he also, how to put this delicately, was considered helpful in love matters, especially in maintaining a happy and active marriage. Bes amulets were common gifts between lovers or newlyweds. One might even be tucked under your pillow on your wedding night just in case. You know, for assistance. You step through a curtain of beads into an apothecary. The air is thick with spices and hope. Shelves overflow with mandrake roots, dried lotus petals, and crocodile fat yeast. Crocodile fat. One recipe recommends mixing it with honey and wine to ensure fidelity. Another, less appetizing blend involves lettuce, frankincense, and, let's just say, the personal essence of a partner. Stirred with intent. Served under moonlight. Ancient Egyptian love magic wasn't all scented candles and flattering verses. Some spells veer into the controlling, even aggressive. A few surviving papyri include phrases like, bind their heart, turn their eyes from others, or let them hunger for no one else. In some cases, wax effigies of the target were buried or burned. Creepy? A little. But also revealing. These people were dealing with the same mess of longing, insecurity, jealousy, and fear of rejection that we do. Only they didn't have DMs or ghosting. They had hippo fat incense and divine petitions to Hathor. You reach for a scroll tucked behind a jar of love oil. It's worn, smudged, but you can still make out a phrase, let my scent reach them even from afar. A long distance spell? A perfume spell? Both? You imagine a lonely man whispering this over a blue lotus blossom, hoping his lover downstream will suddenly think of him and row back upriver. And women weren't shy about this stuff either. In fact, many spells are written in female voice, bold, direct, commanding. One fragment reads, bring him to me, his knees weak, his mouth open, as if dying for water. You pause. That's a line. If Cleopatra had a Tinder bio, it might have been this. You hear laughter outside. 2 young women are comparing necklaces. deciding which charms to wear to the evening's festival. One has a Phaeon's pendant shaped like Hathor's sistrum, a rattle sacred to love and music. The other wears an amulet shaped like a vulvase, really. Because for the Egyptians, the body wasn't something to hide, it was a vessel of power, of creation, of magic. You walk into the evening air, the sun setting behind low hills. As the sky blushes, so does the city. This is the hour when lovers light lamps and prayers mingle with perfume. Somewhere, someone is reciting a spell. Somewhere else, a heart is pounding for someone who hasn't yet noticed them. And in a little market stall by the river, a new shipment of charms has just arrived. You pause, pick one up, and hold it to the light. It's shaped like a pair of entwined lotus flowers, delicate, a little silly, and oddly touching. The merchant winks and says, "For luck and love, or just a good night." In a world where the gods touched every part of life, even your crush had cosmic consequences. So people did what they could. They burned herbs. They whispered names. They trusted that the universe might listen and maybe tip things in their favor. And you slipped the charm into your pocket, just in case. You wake to the sound of linen flapping in the morning breeze, somewhere in a neighborhood nestled against the riverbank. Palm fronds rustle gently overhead, and the quiet murmur of neighbors laughing, calling, arguing flows through the open courtyard like music. Welcome to domestic life in ancient Egypt, where even love had laundry to fold. You're staying with a modest family, a potter, his wife, their 2 kids, and a grandmother who's already grinding grain at the edge of the room. Their home is small but tidy, with painted walls, reed mats, and the unmistakable scent of cumin and crushed coriander. In this space, love isn't a grand festival or a secret spell. It's quieter, but no less powerful. The potter walks past, kisses his wife's forehead, then steps into the sunlight. She rolls her eyes, but smiles once he's gone. You get the sense they've shared that exact routine for years. And in ancient Egypt, that kind of simple affection was prized deep, enduring companionship that made the chaos of Nile life manageable. You notice something hanging near the doorway, a fragment of papyrus with a scribbled verse. It's not a tax record or religious decree, it's a love poem. I made my way to you, through reeds and cold water, but the warmth of your voice, burned brighter than Ra's eye, is barely legible, creased and worn, but someone chose to keep it, and that tells you everything. Egyptians adored love poetry, not just the nobles or scribes every one. These weren't abstract literary flourishes either. They were personal, intimate, often cheeky. Many were written in the first person, with declarations that still make your stomach flutter. Some poems describe the sheer ache of wanting. My heart flutters hastily when I think of your love. It lets me not act sensibly. It leaps from its place. Others are sneakier, like the girl who complains her lover never comes to her mother's house anymore, and wonders if he's scared of the dog. He probably was. Some scholars even call these proto-pop songs relatable, emotional, and just a bit sassy. Historians still argue whether these poems were meant for performance, private reading, or whispered recitations during moonlit walks, but the emotional truth inside them is undeniable. Back in the house, the grandmother chuckles and waves you over. She opens a clay jar and pulls out a tiny carved figure, a couple seated together on a low bench, arms around each other. No crowns, no divine auras, just 2 people. in love. She says nothing, but you can tell it's from her younger days. Marriage in ancient Egypt was rarely a formal legal ceremony. No officiants, no pyramids of cake. Couples simply moved in together, announced their partnership, and if things worked out, stayed. There were documents involved for wealthier families, sure, but for most folks, love was practical. Partnership was emotional and economic. You grew together, you cooked, you raised kids, you argued over fish prices. But affection? That was real. That was expected. Ancient Egyptian marriage advice, texts, those encouraged kindness, emotional closeness, even physical pleasure. Husbands were told to cherish their wives. Wives were encouraged to speak their minds. Divorce was possible and not especially scandalous. And if you married for love, you weren't seen as naive, you were seen as fortunate. You peek into the children's room. Scrawled on the wall in soot is a little drawing, two stick figures, holding hands, a heart between them. Kids, it seems, have always known how to dream. Later, you visit a slightly fancier home, a merchant's estate near the edge of town, with a lovely garden and a tiled fountain. In the atrium, you see a mirror with an inscription around the rim, "To the woman who turned my darkness into festival." Smooth. Might steal that one. Personal gifts like this were common. Mirrors, cosmetics, scented oils, even sandals often exchanged as tokens of affection. One ostrakhan, a shard used for writing notes, contains a message that simply reads, "I bring you honey because your voice is sweeter than it." It's unclear whether that worked, but you admire the effort. One fringe theory suggests couples would sometimes etch poems or pet names into the bottoms of their sandals so they could walk with their love. Adorable, slightly obsessive, possibly sweaty. You sit beside a window overlooking the garden. A young man is pacing, rehearsing a line aloud. "Your eyes snare me like the net of Neath." He grimaces, tries again. You recognize the nerves. First date? Probably. Or maybe the third, and he's trying to say more than "nice tunic." His sister walks by and rolls her eyes. "Just give her the lotus," she says. He groans. It's wilted. You stay quiet, because it's not your business. But yeah, maybe a new lotus. What strikes you is how normal this all is. We tend to imagine ancient societies as either coldly, formal, or wildly exotic, but here, love is awkward, hopeful, sweet. It's in the way she waits for him by the fountain. It's in the way he worries his linen looks wrinkled. It's in the song she hums as she walks away, a little louder now that he's watching. Love, for the ancient Egyptians, wasn't a puzzle or a mystery. It was a necessity, as essential as bread, beer, or the right shade of blue faience. And they honored it not just with myths or magic, but with poetry, patience, and the quiet daily gestures we sometimes forget to notice. As the sun dips behind the walls and the courtyard cools, you stretch out on a reed mat and hear the potter's wife laugh. He's come home, arms full of clay and news. The kids swarm him. She touzles his hair. Another night begins. And you? You feel lucky to have seen it, because some kinds of history you don't read you live. The desert wind picks up as you head south, dust curling at your ankles and the scent of dried papyrus in the air. You're traveling to a city less frequented by nobles and gods, but no less rich in secrets. Deir el Medina. This little village was home to the workers who built the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Think of it as ancient Egypt's version of a gated community for artisans. Skilled, discreet, and, as it turns out, very expressive about sex. You duck into one of the mud brick homes, low-ceilinged but comfortably arranged. The walls are plastered with faint sketches, some geometric, some human, and some, let's just say they're definitely not for children. Erotic graffiti was not uncommon here, and Deir el Medina is practically the Louvre of naughty wall art. One image shows a man balancing a basket on his head while multitasking with a partner. Another features a couple mid-embrace with exaggerated features that leave very little to the imagination. The ancient Egyptian version of Draw Me Like One of Your French Girls? Apparently, yes. But here's the twist. These images weren't hidden in shame. They weren't tucked behind tapestries or scratched out by angry priests. They were celebrated. The people of Deir el Medina lived close to death literally, carving tombs for pharaohs, so perhaps they felt more compelled to celebrate life in full, including its messier, lovelier, lustier aspects. Historians still argue whether this erotic art was purely humorous, instructional, or even satirical. One theory posits that the most infamous collection, now known as the Turin Erotic Papyrus, was actually a parody, mocking religious stiffness with absurdly exaggerated acts. Another theory says, no, it's just straight up ancient smut. Honestly, both can be true. You wander into a small courtyard where two elderly neighbors sit, gossiping over lentil stew. One leans in and whispers about a couple who were caught sneaking behind the granary. The other raises an eyebrow and says, "At least it wasn't the temple steps again." You pretend not to listen, but you're absolutely listening. Love and sex in Deir el Medina weren't the polished rituals of palace life. Here, it was honest, raw. People fell in love, fought, made up, wrote each other biting letters or passionate poems. There's even a preserved note where a man accuses his lover of pouring her sweetness for another. Not exactly subtle, probably ended with a dramatic door slam and some broken pottery. And then there's the magic. You find a dusty box of amulets, tucked under a low shelf, scarabs, ankhs, little carved figurines. But there, gleaming faintly in the light, is a small clay tablet with what looks like a recipe. Hair of the beloved, oil of myrrh, mixed with date wine and breath of the moon, to make his heart burn and his loins rise like raw at dawn. This, you realize, is a love spell. Ancient Egyptians were prolific charm makers, and Deir el Medina's residents were no exception. Love spells, lust charms, anti-cheating, incantations, this village had them all. Some were romantic, others a bit threatening. One papyrus includes a plea to the gods to bind his thoughts to my image, so he sees me even in other women. Not jealous at all, right? You walk past a small shrine dedicated to Bees, the dwarf god of fertility, humor, and protection against bad dreams. He's often shown sticking his tongue out, wielding a tambourine, or dancing like no one's watching. And he was everywhere in Deir el Medina, painted on beds, carved on cosmetic jars, engraved into door frames. Residents believed Bees could guard against evil spirits and maybe bring a bit of spice to the bedroom too. It's nighttime now, and lanterns flicker in windows. You pass a gathering outside, where neighbors share bread, wine, and bawdy stories. A young woman is dared to recite a love poem, and she does blushing but bold. He touched my shoulder, and The fish stop swimming in the stream of my belly. There's a pause, and then laughter. Someone claps. Another offers her a flower. You realize something quietly radical. In this village, sex was not shamed. It was sung, laughed about, lived. A fringe belief even among some modern historians is that couples in Deir el-Medina may have used symbolic roleplay in their private lives, invoking deities like Isis or Hathor to bless the act. Whether you buy into that or not, the takeaway is clear. Sex was spiritual and physical, a full-body hymn to life. As you rest on a rooftop under a sky blooming with stars, a breeze lifts the scent of baking bread and sandalwood. From the house next door, you hear whispers, giggles, a creaking bed frame. You smile. Because tonight, love is alive and well in the workers' village. And tomorrow, someone's gonna etch it all into stone, maybe with a little extra flair. The Nile flows quieter here. The papyrus reeds, standing like sentries along its banks as your small skiff glides toward a temple town known of those mid-sized sacred places that sprouted where the gods were said to have danced, wept, or warred. But tonight, you're not here for battles or miracles. You're here for festivals. Because when ancient Egyptians celebrated love and fertility, they didn't hold back. Your boatman points upriver and chuckles. You're just in time for the festival of Hathor. And suddenly, you understand the mischief behind his grin. You arrive as the streets are already buzzing perfumed oil in the air, sistrums rattling like tambourines, and floral garlands everywhere. Women wear lotus crowns, men paint their eyes with kohl. Even the goats seem unusually festive. The festival of Hathor, goddess of music, joy, beauty, drunkenness, and yes, sex was part religious rite, part full-body celebration of pleasure. You hear singing, laughter, and the low thud of drums echoing off whitewashed walls. At the heart of it all stands Hathor's shrine, carried through the streets in a procession laced with incense and flirtation. You follow the crowd to the temple steps. Dancers swirl in transparent linen, hips undulating like the Nile itself. One woman leans in to whisper something to a priest, who actually blushes. Then he laughs. And just like that, the line between sacred and sensual blurs into something unmistakably Egyptian. Historians still argue whether these festivals included public sexual rites, or if the sensuality was symbolic, theatrical, a sacred flirtation, some call it, but either way the air was charged. Eye contact lingered longer, touches landed more deliberately, wine flowed like an offering to both gods and feelings. You step inside the temple, where reliefs along the walls depict the divine lovemaking of Hathor and Horus in poetic loops of passion. In one corner, a priestess offers honey cakes shaped like fertility symbols, carefully sculpted, highly suggestive, and frankly delicious. Beside her, a musician plucks a harp and sings softly. She comes with the scent of sweet unguents, her fingers trailing desire, her gazea net that snatches the hearts of men. A local tells you that during these festivals, even rigid social boundaries softened. Servants could dance beside nobles. Widows might find a companion for the night. Married couples rekindled their spark under the full moon. It was a sanctioned suspension of the usual order, a moment when Egypt collectively sighed, just live a little. There's a story half folklore, half probable fact about how women used to sail upriver in boats, flashing their bodies at passing fishermen and calling out teasing songs. It was said to be part of the rites of Hathor. Some scholars claim it was symbolic fertility play. Others think it was just a really good party trick. You retreat to a quieter courtyard where elders sip date wine and recount their younger days. One man leans back and says, "I met my wife at a Hathor feast. She spilled honey on my hand and licked it off." He grins. "Married her a week later. Still don't like honey." Nearby, two teenage girls giggle over a folded piece of linen embroidered with love, symbol's eyes, lotus flowers, and a mirror. One says, "I'll wear it tonight. He won't look away." The other rolls her eyes. "He didn't look away yesterday either." Ancient Egyptian festivals weren't just for ritual. They were matchmaking central. If you were young, available, or even mildly curious, this was your moment. People believed that under Hathor's gaze, love found you faster, like bees to hibiscus. There's even an inscription from one temple that reads, "To love her during Hathor's month is to drink joy from the god's own cup." Not subtle, but then again, neither was Egypt, and the alcohol didn't hurt either. Ritual drunkenness wasn't considered scandalous, it was sacred. Inebriation was a path to divine ecstasy, a way to blur the hard lines between human and God. At the climax of the festival, when everyone's cheeks glowed red and music rose to a near howl, people believed Hathor herself entered the crowd. If you felt your pulse quicken, if your lips found someone else's, well, that wasn't just attraction. That was divine intervention. One fringe idea, still debated, is that some festival goers may have written secret wishes or names on lotus petals and floated them down the Nile messages to the goddess. If the petal turned, it meant your love would too. You wonder how many petals bobbed down the current, carrying teenage hopes and very adult desires. The party stretches deep into the night. You pass a woman in her 60s, belly dancing with perfect grace. A young man tries to keep up but trips over his own feet. Laughter explodes. Somewhere nearby, a couple shares pomegranate seed slowly, teasingly, like they're inventing foreplay. And above it all, the stars glitter cold and distant, as if they, too, are watching. As the drums soften and the crowd thins, you sit by a fire, its warmth licking your skin. The air smells of musk and rose. Someone hands you a final cup of wine, and you realize something gentle and profound. For all their grandeur, Egyptians knew that gods were found not just in thunder and stone, but in desire, in celebration, in the way someone looked at you when they thought you weren't paying attention. And for one night under Hathor's gaze, it was all allowed. The sun is up again, but your mind is still tangled in the festival's afterglow, its tambourines, pomegranate kisses, and the scent of oil on dancing skin. But now the path veers inward, literally. You find yourself ducking beneath a narrow stone archway, deeper into the heart of an ancient home. It's cool here, a sanctuary from the heat and also the domain of one of Egypt's most overlooked power centers, the bedroom. You stand beside a low wooden frame bed. Its legs are carved like lion paws. The headrest is a curved slab of polished stone knot, exactly the plush pillows you're used to. But hey, ancient Egyptians weren't messing around with posture or symbolism. Even this piece, meant to cradle your skull, was often inscribed with spells to guard dreams and passions. Here in the home, love and sex weren't public spectacle or state ceremony. They were intimate, sometimes poetic, sometimes mundane, but always present. You run your hand along the wall, and your fingers brush over an old carving faint but still readable. It's a calendar of lucky and unlucky days for conception. That's right. Ancient Egyptians kept sex calendars. Certain days were considered ideal for making a child, while others were inharmonious, prone to misfortune, or weak offspring. Imagine marking your calendar. Tuesday, nope, Osiris is grumpy. Historians still argue whether these calendars were guided more by astrology, lunar phases, or priestly tradition. Likely a mix. One quirky example includes advice like, avoid the seventh day, for it is the day of Seth's anger. So if you skip that date, you weren't avoiding intimacy, you were being cautious. Like avoiding sushi before a flight, but sexier. Even pregnancy had its rituals. Women used fertility amulets and, in some cases, even early pregnancy tests. No joke. One method involved urinating on wheat and barley seeds. If they sprouted, congratulations, you were pregnant. If not, well, maybe try again on a more harmonious day. There's evidence that couples track their love lives with the same precision they manage their crops. Inscriptions reference nights of sweetness, days of the flower, and offerings of the body. One household papyrus even includes a short poem. His touch brought the Nile's flood. My thighs parted like gates before the feast. Subtle? Not exactly. But heartfelt? Absolutely. Of course, love wasn't always smooth sailing. You step into the small kitchen area and find a sliver of pottery with black ink scrawled on it. It's an ostracona shard used for quick writing. This one reads, he came with wine and sweet words. He left with my anklet and heart. Ancient ghosting? Possibly. The ache of unreturned affection is timeless. But what's really interesting is that these moments, these deeply personal slices of life, were often recorded. Unlike cultures that shrouded love in mysticism or erased it from the record, Egyptians wrote poems, drew cartoons, and filed their feelings on temple walls or laundry shards. There's a famous poem from the New Kingdom, often considered one of the earliest domestic love poems in history. It reads, I would be her laundryman for just one day, to touch her linens and breathe the scent of her skin in them. A bit stalkerish? Maybe, but also kinda sweet. You can picture this laundryman standing by the Nile, daydreaming over a tunic, still warm from her shoulders. You peek into a cosmetics box painted, delicate, with sliding compartments. Inside, coal, malachite, scented oils, and a small ivory comb. Both men and women in Egypt were serious about appearance, not just for public show, but for each other. Prepping for a date meant eyeliner, perfume, and maybe even a quick chant to be ease for lasting favor. Fringe theory time. Some scholars suggest that certain oils weren't just cosmetic or perfumed, but mildly aphrodisiacal. Think frankincense and myrrh not just as church incense, but low-key love potions. It's possible some of those bedroom oils weren't just for dry elbows. Beside the cosmetics lies a scrap of cloth with a red symbol drawn on Itah protective sigil. Maybe this was tied to a bedpost during intimacy to ward off jealous spirits or ensure fertility. Or maybe it was just a lucky charm. Either way, there's a beautiful belief under it all, that love needed its own form of armor. You lie back on the ancient bed. It creaks just slightly, and the headrest feels, well, terrible. But you let your imagination go. Picture a couple lying here 3,000 years ago, laughing, whispering, negotiating, cuddling rights. Maybe they just returned from the market, Maybe she teased him for tracking another unlucky day. Maybe he promised, "Tonight I don't care about the gods, I just want to be close." Because even here, even now, across millennia and dust and dynasties, the most personal moments linger. And somewhere, just beyond the veil of time, a woman smiles in her linen gown, adjusts her coal, and opens the door to someone she's been waiting for. You stretch your arms as you rise from that ancient bed, the imagined weight of linen still warm on your skin. There's a quiet stillness in the air now, broken only by distant birds and the occasional donkey bray. But your feet carry you outside again, toward a side street where love wasn't whispered, it was negotiated. Because while many ancient Egyptians found their passions wrapped in poems and moonlit festivals, others met theirs through contracts. Literal love agreements, signed, sealed, and witnessed because, hey, romance is grand, but legal clarity is eternal. You pause beside a reed paper stand where a scribe once sat, his ink-stained fingers ready to document not only land sales or grain tallies, but also prenups. Marital contracts in Egypt were surprisingly progressive and shockingly detailed. A typical agreement might include lines like, "Should the husband take another wife, the first shall retain all property she brought into the house," or, "If he departs, she shall receive 2 deben of silver and her livestock." You tilt your head. Romance by way of notary, it's oddly reassuring. Clear terms, mutual respect, and no messy texting habits to decode. One fragment found near Thebes even included clauses about monthly allowances and shared chores. Imagine an ancient husband scribbling, "Agrees to carry water on festival days," in carefully looped hieroglyphs. Charming. And probably court admissible. Historians still argue whether these agreements stemmed from deep gender equity or practical economics. But either way, Egyptian women had remarkable legal standing. They could own land, initiate divorce, and retain custody of children. In fact, a woman could leave her husband and keep the house if the terms were in her favor. Eat your heart out, Elizabethan England. Of course, not every love story came with ink and witnesses. Many unions were more informal common law marriages based on cohabitation. If you lived together, pooled grain, and called each other beloved, that was often enough. Your neighbor might casually ask, "How's your husband?" And you'd shrug, "Still asleep. He ate too many figs." But even informal partnerships were not without heart. There's a letter from a man to his estranged partner found in Deir el Medina that reads, "Come back. The bed is cold without you. I made your favorite stew." The ancient Egyptian version of, "I messed up, please come home." No emoji needed. You turn a corner and enter the district where artisans once lived, the skilled workers of tombs and temples. Their love lives, just as lively. Among their ruins, archaeologists found walls carved not just with prayers, but love notes. Literal hieroglyphic graffiti. "My heart dances when she passes," or "He is strong like tar and smells like sweet resin." You imagine a stonemason wiping his brow, carving one last compliment before heading home with a lotus stem in his teeth. But here comes a curveball. Not all Egyptian love stories fit neatly into male-female boxes. Some fringe interpretations of artwork and poetry suggest same-sex affection may have existed, though mainstream Egyptology treads cautiously. A famous tomb in Saqqara features 2 men, Khnumhotep and Nianchchnum, buried side by side with imagery traditionally reserved for married couples. Nose touching, hand holding, and a level of intimacy that screams closeness. Historians still argue whether the pair were lovers, brothers, or simply best friends whose bond defied easy definition. But the very ambiguity invites you to imagine a world where love, in all its variations, might have been quietly accepted, even if not loudly celebrated. And love could be just that quiet. A morning walk, a song hummed while cooking, a bundle of fresh dates left beside someone's door. Egyptians used the phrase to live together as husband and wife to describe not just the legal act, but the comfort of shared existence. That said, there were rules. Adultery wasn't taken lightly. While the punishments varied, ranging from social shame to legal penalties, it's clear that betrayal was considered a disruption of Ma'at, the cosmic order. Not because it was sinful necessarily, but because it introduced chaos. And in Egypt, chaos was always the enemy. You reach a courtyard now where mock trials were sometimes held, not courtroom dramas, but public performances meant to reinforce community values. In one reenactment, a man defends his choice to marry a second wife. A woman retorts, "Then double the grain and don't sleep in my bed." The crowd howls. Even then, Egyptians knew how to roast. Marriage wasn't just about love. It was an economic alliance, a social contract, a small temple built from shared duties and salted lentils. But passion still played its part. A stela from the 19th dynasty reads, "I dreamt of her every night. I built a house for her and called it my joy." Now that's commitment and maybe a bit of over-planning. In one record, a woman, clearly fed up, left a note in her husband's belongings that read, "You forget my name in the dark. You forget my gifts at market. You remember your beer, but not my eyes." She was either a poet or a viral tweet waiting to happen. You sit beside a drying line where old linens hang yellowed now, but once fresh and fragrant. You imagine a woman folding sheets after a long day, brushing her husband's hair, or wrapping her children in sleep. This was love too, not just the dramatic highs, but the soft, enduring middle. Egyptians might not have had dating apps, but they had moonlit walks, wine-sweet breath, and the kind of glances that made you drop your bread. Their stories etched in stone or spilled on pottery remind you that love has always been part survival, part poetry, and part delightful chaos. And always worth the contract. You leave behind the dry linens and legal scrolls, stepping softly into a more shadowed quarter of the city. The alleys are narrower here, the whispers quieter. And while you've just walked through the world of contracts and courtships, there's another layer to the Egyptian view of sex own, not always spoken aloud, but just as enduring. The magic of it. Yes, magic, not metaphorical. Literal spells, charms, and rituals. To the ancient Egyptians, sex was not just physical or emotional, it was spiritual. And that meant you could influence it, enhance it, even manipulate it, which is where you find yourself now, standing before a small vendor stall. Clay bowls, papyri, amulets, a local love technician. This isn't fantasy. Erotic magic was a real, accepted part of Egyptian life. There were spells to attract a lover, spells to reignite desire in a fading marriage, and yes, spells to cause impotence in a rival. Because if you're going to flirt with the divine, why not go full drama? You kneel beside a small ceramic jar. Inside, a bundle of dried herbs tied with red stringan ancient aphrodisiac blend. We don't know the full recipe, but scholars have found references to wild lettuce, frankincense, honey, and mandrake root. Mandrake especially was revered. Its oddly human-like shape and potent scent gave it a reputation as a love amplifier. Or, in modern terms, the original date night essential oil. One papyrus even includes a spell that instructs the reader to grind certain ingredients, chant a name, and then whisper their desires into a flame while staring into an anointed mirror. The goal? To soften the heart and fire the body. And you thought aromatherapy was trendy now. Historians still argue whether these love spells were truly believed to work or were more performative confidence boosters with flair. But for the Egyptians, belief and magic were often the same thing. If the spell helped you feel bolder, more alluring, more in control, wasn't it already working? A quirky detail. Some of these rituals involved beeswax figurines. You'd mold a tiny likeness of the one you desired, speak their name, anoint it with oil, and place it under your bed. The idea was sympathetic. Magic-like attracts like. One spell advises you to bind the feet of the wax man so he may walk only toward you. Creepy? Maybe, but admit it, you've seen worse on TikTok. Even jewelry carried erotic significance. Amulets shaped like Hathor's face, lotus blossoms, or even phalluses weren't just decorative, they were protection, attraction, and energy boosters. A man might wear a small stone carving shaped like the god Min, Egypt's deity of fertility and virility. Min was often depicted, enthusiastically, with lettuce in one hand, because apparently lettuce was considered a sexual stimulant. Yes, lettuce. You'll never look at your salad the same way again. You step into a dim house now, where a young woman sits weaving charms into the hem of her linen dress. Tiny knots, each one murmured over. Bring him near. Make him see me. This wasn't manipulation. It was a kind of hope, a prayer wrapped in fabric, a wish stitched beside every fold. Of course, not all erotic magic was about attraction. Some was protective. Women, especially, used charms to shield themselves from unwanted attention. A small blue scarab, a knot of Isis, or a copper ring inscribed with basalt talismans meant to deflect harm and hold control. Because even in a society that embraced sex, boundaries still mattered. In the city of Akhmim, fragments of a temple ritual suggest that priestesses once led ceremonies invoking Hathor, asking her to bless the beds of women who love with courage. It's a tantalizing phrase, one that suggests sex was not just allowed, but sacred and brave. There's a faded wall painting here, barely visible under centuries of dust. It shows a woman reclining, eyes closed, as a servant anoints her feet. In the corner, a scribe writes the word Senegem, meaning delight. No nudity, no scandal, just intimacy, depicted as art. You sit for a moment beside a brazier, still warm with scented ash. The air smells of myrrh and orange blossom. You imagine someone preparing this space for love, not hurried or hidden, but intentional. Lighting the coals, laying out oils, whispering a few words to a god or goddess whose ear they trusted. There's something reverent about it. And while many of these rituals were private, some were community-based. At festivals like the beautiful Festival of the Valley, groups of women would gather to sing erotic songs of Hathor, filled with innuendo and laughter. One chant translates roughly to, "He is the bread, and I am the hungry mouth." And suddenly you understand why those festivals were so well attended. What's striking isn't that these rituals existed, it's how normalized they were. There was no shame, no secrecy, just the understanding that desire was part of the sacred flow of life. Like water, or sunlight or breath. Something to be respected, directed, celebrated. You pick up a piece of pottery with a scratched out spell. Let his eyes be like the sun, turned only toward me. It's personal, vulnerable. Someone's raw longing etched in a moment of hope. Maybe it worked, maybe it didn't. But in that act of writing, the believing there's a kind of magic already. Even today, we light candles, set moods, whisper wishes into the dark. Maybe we've swapped BEs for playlists and oils for cologne. But the impulse is the same: to attract, to connect, to be seen. So you walk away from that quiet room, the echo of spells and saffron still in your nose, reminded that sometimes magic is just love with extra steps. You emerge into warm morning light, golden and slow, as if the Nile itself had poured sunshine through the air. The incense of that last room still lingers in your senses, but the spellwork gives way now to something more public, more performative, the theater of love played out in art and music. Because while the Egyptians practiced their intimacy in privacy and magic, they also broadcast Iton temple walls, in love songs, in carvings tucked behind tomb doors. Yes, this was a culture where sensuality wasn't just whispered. It was drawn, painted, sung, a little cheeky, a little sacred, and a lot more fun than your average museum tour lets on. You step into a courtyard dotted with small statues, many of which, at first glance, look perfectly ordinary until you take a closer peek. That musician, her flute might not just be for music. That couple reclining under a fig tree, their gaze holds more than polite affection. Egyptian artists often worked with layers, one for the gods, one for society, and one just maybe for a mischievous smile. Let's talk about the Turin erotic papyrus, because how could we not? Found in Deir el-Medina and dating back to the Ramesside period, this infamous scroll is a work of pure chaos and genius. It's divided into two parts. The first features animals doing human things. You haven't lived until you've seen a lion pouring wine for a donkey. And the second, well, it's a very detailed, very exaggerated series of erotic scenes. Some historians call it satire, others see it as adult humor for an elite audience, and some still argue whether it was pornographic or ritualistic. Whatever the intent, it's clear that ancient Egyptians weren't shy about body parts, positions, or poking a little fun at their own human appetites. And yes, some of the figures are bald, paunchy, and possibly intoxicated. Ancient people, they're just like us. You turn now toward a mural fragment featuring two young lovers sitting in a boat surrounded by lotus blossoms. One is playing a harp. The other is handing over what looks like a pomegranatea fruit often linked to fertility and sensuality. The composition is gentle, almost sleepy, but the implication is clear. This is a moment of courtship, of anticipation, of longing dressed in metaphor. Egyptian love poetry, especially from the New Kingdom, was a masterclass in suggestion. You'd hear lines like, "My heart is at home when your hand holds mine," or "He has stolen my heart with a single glance, like a thief in the dark." These weren't just abstract emotions. The poems spoke of physical yearning in a language that was both elegant and undeniably charged. In one particularly vivid verse, a woman says, "I would be the washer of your body, that I may touch your limbs," which, if you ask any modern listener, still holds up as one of the more effective pickup lines. The best part? These poems were often written from the female perspective, filled with desire, confidence, and humor. Historians still debate whether these poems were read aloud at gatherings, whispered between lovers, or simply enjoyed in private. But their very survival suggests they were treasured copied on papyri, scratched on ostraca, murmured beneath moonlight, or beside wine jugs. You pass by a group of young men gathered around a storyteller. He's half singing, half speaking, a tale of a divine seduction, perhaps Isis disguising herself to approach Osiris, or Hathor dancing to awaken the sun god Ra. The line between myth and flirtation in Egyptian culture was always a little blurry. And that was the point. Because in Egypt, pleasure wasn't profane, was divine. Hathor, the goddess of love, beauty, dance, and drunkenness, was often invoked in celebration. Her cult center in Dendera featured festivals where participants drank wine, played music, and celebrated life's sweeter sides. One festival inscription even encourages guests to eat, drink, make love, for tomorrow is hidden. That live while you can philosophy, not just a bumper sticker, it's ancient wisdom, backed by some serious party planning. There's a scene you may remember from earlier. Couples walking hand in hand during festivals, their eyes lined in kohl, their jewelry catching firelight. These moments were sensual but not scandalous. To the Egyptians, joy was not something to be earned through suffering, it was something sacred in its own right. Even funerary art, which we often associate with solemnity, occasionally included small, tender details. A husband handing fruit to his wife, or a young girl braiding her lover's hair in the afterlife. These were not just gestures, they were promises that even beyond death, pleasure and affection would follow. You sit now at the base of a half-buried obelisk, listening as a musician tunes her lyre. The instrument hums lightly in the air, as though the stones themselves remember the music. One tune passed down for generations speaks of a woman who dreams of swimming with her beloved in the sacred lake, where lotus blooms rise as our kisses. It's romantic, it's musical, and yes, it's sensual, but never vulgar. That's the dance Egypt perfected, walking the line between sacred and suggestive with the ease of a scribe's brush. A quirky artifact nearby shows a monkey playing a lute while a cat watches with what can only be described as romantic suspicion. It's lighthearted, possibly absurd, and definitely an example of how art let the Egyptians poke fun at desire without shaming it. And that's the heart of it, isn't it? Whether painted on papyri, etched into a wall, or murmured in verse, love and sex weren't confined to shadows. They were celebrated in light, color, and melody. So you rise again, music trailing behind you like a ribbon, and remember that for the ancient Egyptians, desire wasn't something to hide. It was something to compose, to carve, to dance, and possibly to share with a donkey-pouring, lion-themed cartoon if the mood was right. You drift now toward the riverbank, where the reeds sway in slow, hypnotic rhythm, and the air hums with the subtle pulse of ancient life. The Nile, patient and eternal, glimmers with late sunlight, and just like that, you're reminded that everything in Egypt, even sex, flows in cycles. Desire, fertility, birth, decay, it's all part of a much larger dance. And nowhere is that more evident than in their creation myths. If you've ever imagined the universe beginning with a bang, brace yourself. In Egyptian cosmogony, it began with a sneeze. Or, depending on the version, something a bit more hands-on. In the Heliopolitan tradition, the god Atum creates the first divine couple shoe in Tefnutbi, an act of, well, solo generation. That's right, self-pleasure as a divine creative force. It's not just metaphorical, it's written that Atum brought forth life by using his own body as the vessel of Genesis. This isn't just bold, it's theological gold. The act of sexual energy of release was seen as sacred power, a literal act of cosmic ordering. And unlike many later cultures that demonize such self-expression, Egypt wove it right into the story of everything. From that seed of Adam came air, moisture, sky, earth, and eventually humanity. The idea that life itself sprang from a private act sets the tone for how Egyptians viewed desire not as a shameful secret, but as a fundamental engine of the universe. Historians still argue whether these myths were understood symbolically by the masses or taken more literally by early priests. But either way, the message was clear. Sex creates, sustains, and mirrors the divine. You pass a group of temple boys cleaning statues with wet cloths, and one of them hums an old hymn of Thoth God who conceived the world in his heart and spoke it into being. Here again, there's a sensual metaphor, heart and tongue, thought and utterance. Creation is not violent, it is deliberate, almost intimate. The Memphite theology takes this even further. It suggests that Ptah dreamed up the cosmos, and the act of forming it was like shaping clay with his hands and breath. He crafted gods and men. It's a sensual image full of texture, touch, and warmth. Not accidental, not random, but intentional, lovingly made. You sit now beside a low-relief carving of Nut and Gebskian earth, lovers separated by Shu, the god of air. Their bodies once pressed together, now held apart. Geb reaches up, Nut arches down. They never stop longing. Every night she swallows the sun. Every morning she gives birth to it again. Their eternal cycle isn't tragic, it's erotic in the most poetic sense. Desire without end. Longing that keeps time moving. Some scholars see this myth as a metaphor for rain and growth, others for the day-night cycle. But maybe it's both and more. The bodies of gods becoming maps for the rhythms of the world. You breathe deeper just imagining it. In temple rites, these stories weren't just told, they were reenacted. Priests and priestesses played roles in passion plays. Sometimes, statues of gods were awakened with oils, music, and even physical gestures. It wasn't mere ritual, it was flirtation with the divine. One fringe but fascinating theory suggests that some priestesses may have served as brides of the god-chosen women who enacted sacred union rites, channeling fertility into the land. There's little direct evidence, but tantalizing whispers remain in temple records. Whether symbolic or literal, the message echoes loud. The sexual was spiritual, and the spiritual deeply sensual. Even the concept of the Cathay vital spiritual essence of a person was believed to carry the capacity for love and desire in the afterlife. That's right, you didn't leave your appetite behind when you died. The dead were often buried with images of lovers, perfumes, and even erotic art not as decoration, but as equipment for continued pleasure in eternity. A quirky detail pops up here. Some tombs included food offerings specifically chosen for their aphrodisiac properties dates. Figs, honey cakes. The idea was that even in death, one might host a romantic rendezvous. After all, what's paradise without a little dessert and flirtation? You wander through a grove of sycamores now, sacred to Hathor, and see a young woman pouring water onto the roots. She's praying not for rain or riches, but for a child. For generations, couples came here to make offerings, believing that intimacy beneath the branches would increase fertility. Imagine honeymooning under a divine tree, the ultimate ancient blessed venue. The sacred and the sensual weren't separate compartments in Egyptian thought. They were threads in the same cloth. Pleasure wasn't an escape from duty, it was an expression of harmony. To love well was to live in Ma'at, the balance of all things. And this cosmic balance wasn't just for mortals. Even the gods got frisky. Osiris and Isis, in one version of the myth, reunite after Osiris's murder. Isis reconstructs his body, missing a critical part, which she crafts anew. Their union leads to the conception of Horus, the Avenger, love conquering death, desire as resurrection. You smile because even in this grand myth, the Egyptians managed to tell you something beautifully human, that love is creative, that sex can heal. That intimacy, even in fragments, is how the universe stitches itself back together. So you walk on, the wind lifting papyrus stalks like fingertips brushing across your skin, and realize Egypt's view of sex wasn't just physical, it was metaphysical, a channel, a spark, a whisper of the gods in every touch. And if you're lucky, maybe even in a sneeze, the sun begins to sink and a dusky pink settles over the Nile like a warm sigh. You stand at the edge of a field that has just been harvested. The air smells of straw and river mist, and from somewhere nearby, you hear the distant beat of a hand drum slow, steady, like a pulse. And just like that, you begin to feel the weight of everything this journey has revealed. Tonight has not been about scandal or voyeurism or peering behind a curtain that was meant to stay closed. No hat you've been walking through is a world where sex wasn't hidden in shame but woven into the very breath of existence. A world where desire was ritual, where love was law, and where pleasure wasn't sinful, it was sacred. But for all their openness, the Egyptians still had boundaries. Consent, respect, and mutual care were baked into the expectations of intimacy. The legal papyri speak clearly. Forced sex was a crime. Adultery carried social penalties. There were rules, just not the ones you might expect from a society so comfortable with naked bodies and bedroom poetry. You pass a small home, its mud brick walls still standing after thousands of years. Inside, faint carvings show a husband and wife reclining together on a mat. Not in a grand palace, not among golden statues, but in the quiet intimacy of shared space. Their faces wear gentle smiles. Their arms are loosely draped around one another. This, too, was part of the equation. Companionship, affection, the quiet, sleepy kind of closeness that doesn't make the papyri, but stays with you long after the festival music fades. A quirky historical tidbit flickers to mind. Egyptian women had more legal rights in relationships than many ancient cultures. They could initiate divorce, own property, and in some contracts, even include clauses about how often their husbands should visit them in bed. That's right, ancient prenups with a built-in snuggle quota. Modern couples, take note. And speaking of paperwork, marriage in Egypt wasn't always a formal ceremony. It often began with something as simple as a man bringing a woman into his home and the two beginning to live as husband and wife. No sacred vows, no white gowns, just mutual intent and perhaps a witness or two. Historians still argue whether this looseness meant casual unions or simply a flexible understanding of partnership. What's clear is that relationships were treated with nuance, not all passion, not all property, but a dance between the two. You walk past a wall painting in a now quiet tomb. It shows two women, possibly lovers, possibly close friends, sex-changing lotus blossoms. Their gazes meet in that unmistakable way, fond, familiar, and lingering just a second too long to be platonic. The Egyptians didn't categorize love the way modern cultures do. Desire wasn't labeled so strictly. Some scholars believe same-sex relationships were accepted in certain contexts, while others argue the evidence is too sparse. But the art remains soft and ambiguous, like a memory you're not sure you dreamed. Even eunuchs, a topic often cloaked in silence, held court roles and priestly functions in Egypt. The Egyptians didn't obsess over conformity to rigid gender roles. Masculinity wasn't all swords and shouting. Femininity wasn't confined to child rearing. Gods themselves blurred lines. Think of Hapi, the Nile god, depicted with both beard and breasts. Fertile and nurturing, powerful and fluid, a deity for those who didn't fit the mold. You pause near a faded inscription, difficult to read, but just clear enough to make out one line. My lover is the breeze that moves the reeds. That's it. No names, no genders. Just longing, hidden in poetry and pressed between time and stone. And now you feel the arc of it all. From the temples to the bedrooms, from the myth to the music, you've seen how sex was not an act of hiding, but of revealing. A way to understand the cosmos, to channel divine energy, to affirm life against death. Egypt wasn't perfect. No civilization is. Power was still unequally held, and hierarchies still marked who could love freely and who had to ask permission. But in their art, in their language, in the way they held each other's hands on tomb walls, they gave us a roadmap to intimacy without shame. You kneel by the water's edge now, watching as the last light dips beneath the horizon. A couple laughs quietly behind you, barefoot in the mud, their joy soft and unguarded. And you realize the Egyptians were never really obsessed with sex for its own sake. They were obsessed with connection to each other, to the gods, to the land. Sex was simply one of the languages they used to speak that connection aloud. The music slows, the breeze stills, the Nile, as always, carries on. And now, here you are, resting in the warm shadow of everything you've just heard. The images, the myths, the gentle laughter of lovers long gone. You feel the softness of linen against skin, the whisper of lotus blossoms floating down a quiet canal, the rhythmic hush of oars pushing through water lit by moonlight. Your body grows heavier, but your mind stays light just enough to float, not enough to wander. There is comfort in knowing that long before skyscrapers and streaming apps and fluorescent lights, humans touched each other with tenderness, loved with poetry, and made space for laughter between the sheets. Let that thought stay with you. Let it rock you gently. Breathe in once. Hold. Breathe out. Let go. Good night.